Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome to another installment of Lady Gwyn and Friends. We are back for the second volume here, and I'm happy to welcome my guest, Maester Merry. Hi.
Hello, so good to be here.
Hi. Well, it's great to have you. Thank you very much for being here for this new live stream series. We're talking in the waiting room earlier about just kind of reveling in the randomness of the chapters that people will choose. So I'm very excited about the chapter that you chose, uh, which is, let us know. I think it's in the chat.
Arya II, A Feast for Crows.
Yes.
Yeah, I've delivered on the promise to give a random chapter.
Well, it's fantastic. We were both guests recently with our friend Sanrixian on her Twitch channel, and you were on last week talking about Theon. She's doing a great. If you guys don't, anyone in the chat doesn't know or listening now or in the future doesn't know Sanrixian, she's a fantastic artist that does a lot of Song of Ice and Fire art, and the project that she's doing right now is doing analysis of Winds of Winter chapters with guests from the fandom, such as both of us. I think she's got Joe Magician, who was my guest here 2 months ago, coming up tomorrow, and they talk. And instead of looking at people's faces on the screen, you get to see Samri creating amazing Song of Ice and Fire art inspired by the chapters. So the reason why that is relevant, and by the way, there's where you can find her if you're interested tomorrow night with Joe Magician talking about, I forget, something from the Winds of Winter.
The Forsaken. It's the Forsaken, I think.
Of course. How could I forget that?
Yeah.
The Forsaken. Thank you for having information that I forgot to write down. When I was on 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the Mercy chapter, and I specifically mentioned that because there is a through line from the chapter that Mary chose for today, Right to Mercy. And it's long and pointy. And that's all I'll say for now. So, yeah. So, Arya, just, she's one of my favorites. Yours, I assume, also.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So we know she's one of George's favorites, and George's wife's very favorite character. So yeah, she's the only character that has chapters in all 5 books. Yeah. So this is really, I think, a great, a pivotal chapter for her. And before we start talking about the chapter, one thing I like to do, which I actually didn't get a chance to do when I had Joe Magician because we did the Game of Thrones prologue chapter, which obviously is the very first, and it's sort of all on its own there. I like to give you a bit of information of how this chapter sits in relation to the main narrative. So, as far as Arya's narrative, it's Arya II of A Feast for Crows. So it sits in between Arya 1, which is when she was on the ship to Bravos, and just a moment, please. Just a moment. I 100% forgot to start recording. So I'm so sorry. So Arya is on her way to Bravos in the first chapter, and in this chapter, she is obviously in Bravos, and Arya 3 is her Cat of the Canals chapter, which deals with her first undercover assignment for the Faceless Men. So, sometime during this particular chapter, she probably, after consulting with my timeline, looks like she turns 11. So
I
we're
didn't
thinking,
realize that we picked an Arya's birthday chapter, and it's like both my kids' birthdays right now. So,
oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, hopefully they have
Better birthdays than
Better
Arya Stark.
birthdays than
Yes, yes.
Arya. Yeah. So because from Arya 1 of A Feast for Crows onwards, Arya's chapters are basically removed from the mainland Westeros narrative. Although we do eventually get a handful of things that anchor her, like Sam showing up in Bravos. You hear people talk about Jon and Dany eventually in the Mercy chapter. You get Raph. Those things will anchor her to what's happening in Westeros. But I thought it would be fun to tell you what everyone else is doing while Arya is in Bravos in this particular chapter. Tyrion is aboard the Shy Maid. So he's also in Essos. Sam, Gilly, and Maester Aemon are making their way towards Bravos. You've got Jon at the wall. Stannis heading into the mountains to meet the clans, the mountain clans. Ramsay and Theon are currently taking Moat Cailin back from the Ironborn. You have Asha Greyjoy at Deepwood Motte. Davos is in White Harbor. Brienne of Tarth is traveling with Nimble Dick Crab. Some of my favorite chapters. Those of you who know me.
Lots of good stuff happening right now.
Very good stuff there. You've got Mace Tyrell at Storm's End. Jaime and Cersei are both in King's Landing. Jaime has not left yet. I think they're probably still dealing with Tywin's funerals or some such. Bran Stark is making his way north. He's beyond the wall and making his way to Bloodraven's cave. Arianne and the her Princess in the Tower chapter, which actually immediately precedes Arya II in Feast for Crows, is pretty concurrent with this chapter. And far, far away, Quentin Martell has joined the Windblown, and Dany is dealing with the Sons of the Harpy, wondering if she should go ahead and marry his star. So that's what's happening. That's where we fit on the timeline. And as far as within the book, like I said, the Queenmaker chapter comes right before, and right after is Elaine 1, which is actually Sansa 2 in A Feast for Crows, where Sansa is learning about the Game of Thrones from Littlefinger. And that's actually relevant. We'll talk about it later, how that chapter actually, that following on from this chapter is somewhat relevant. So yeah, let's dive in. Let's dive into a chapter, get everybody up to speed with what's happening specifically in the chapter, and then we'll
there's a lot that happens in this one, so it's kind of packed.
Yeah. So settle in, because this is pretty wide ranging. A lot of backstory, a lot of Arya internal stuff, and just a lot that happens. So it starts with Arya still reciting her list of names, which is still Sir Gregor, Dunsen, Wrath the Sweetling, Sir Ilyn, Sir Meryn, Queen Cersei. And it adds, she would have whispered the names of the Freys of the Crossing too, if she had known them. One day I'll know, she told herself, and then I'll kill them all. So her list has grown. She just doesn't know how many Freys or who they are. She wants to kill them all, though. So the kindly man is definitely aware that Arya is saying these names. It says no whisper was too faint to be heard in the House of Black and White, and he comes to her and asks her what the names mean. She, of course, tries to avoid answering, but he insists, and she says, fine. You can hear her like, fine. They're people I hate. I want them to die.
This is one of my favorite bits in this chapter. When Arya lies, she says, I don't whisper any names. The kindly man says, all men lie when they're afraid. Some tell many lies, some but a few. Some have only one great lie that they tell so often they come to believe it. How afraid is Arya, given how much she lies? And I wonder, too, what do we think Arya's great lie is? And an interesting thought for later, too, is what other characters have a great lie? I think George R. Martin is using the kindly man here to give us some insight into his character work. It's really neat.
Yeah, that is really cool, and that's a rabbit hole we could go down probably for hours.
We could, yeah.
Like people's lies, and what he's trying to say to us about with all that. But also with that in mind, given Ned's famous exchange with Bran from A Game of Thrones, can a man still be brave if he's afraid? That's the only time a man can be brave. I mean, how brave is Arya if she's that afraid? So by process of, um, just next step, my next thought was, well, she's she's afraid, but she's obviously being very brave. So
Perfect. I think
yeah,
George wants us to think exactly that.
yeah,
And it's really easy to focus on how brave Arya is because she puts on a brave face. But when
mhm.
you read her chapters, and I think this chapter in particular, it's really palpable how much fear is underneath the bravery.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we have picked out a lot of those moments as we go forward. So the kindly man, uh, he asks Arya point blank if she's there to learn how to kill these people, and she says maybe. And I just love picturing her being like, maybe
You
if
caught
you
me.
insist, you caught me. Yeah. But he says that's not what we do. It's not for you to say who shall live and who shall die. This is sort of an ongoing theme that he's going to hit with Arya. This is we are servants of the many-faced God. We sworn to do His will. Um, Arya looks around it. They're in the hall of the House of Black and White with all the different gods, and she reveals she doesn't know what he's talking about. She wonders which god he is, and he says all of them. So
I I love this moment. I love the how overwhelmed Arya is, obviously, but I also love how the kindly man tells her explicitly, "Then you've come to the wrong place." When
mm,
she admits that she might be there to learn how to kill people, that's a good thing to stash away for later because I think this chapter is very unsubtle about Arya being out of place.
mhm.
And how that fits in with the rest of the Faceless Men's agenda.
Yes, 100%. And that's another. Well, it's a through line throughout. I think throughout her Bravo's
Stay.
chapters, and
Yeah.
it's definitely sort of that culminates in mercy. Um, So we can talk about that later. So Arya's in the temple, living with the basically a couple of other acolytes, the one who's known as the Waif and some servants. But the only person that she speaks a language in common with is the kindly man. So he's the only person she can talk to until she finally learns how to speak Bravosi. Every day he asks her who she is, and she answers that she's no one. Though in her heart, we know, and it's explicit that she's still Arya Stark. Do you want to read this quote, Mary? This
Yeah,
amazing, very
I
sad quote.
do.
Get your tissues out, everybody.
She who had been Arya of House Stark, Arya Underfoot, Arya Horseface. She had been Ari and Weasel too, and Squab and Salty, Non the Cupbearer, a grey mouse, a sheep, the ghost of Harrenhal. But not for true, not in her heart of hearts. In there, she was Arya of Winterfell, the daughter of Lord Eddard Stark and Lady Catelyn, who once had brothers named Robb and Bran and Rickon, and a sister named Sansa, a direwolf called Nymeria, a half-brother named Jon Snow. In there, she was someone, but that was not the answer that he wanted. Ah, it chokes me up every
I
time.
know. Yes,
Ah,
me
you
too.
know, she's already worn so many names, if not faces, yet. And here she is. She's lying because she's afraid of what will happen if she doesn't give him the answer that he wants. It's just so easy again to overlook the fear in Arya's chapters, but the fear is there if you know where to look, and also this sadness. The passive void when sorry, the past tense. Who once had brothers? Who once had a half brother named Jon Snow? Oh, it's very sad.
Yeah, that is tragic. Yeah.
Ugh.
Oh gosh. So, uh, because she doesn't speak their language yet, I find this interesting. They join together every morning to say their morning prayers to the many-faced God, she doesn't speak Bravosi, so she says her prayer silently. Only her prayer is the one that they've told her she can't say, but they can't stop her saying it in her head. And her reasoning with saying that prayer silently while they're engaged in this prayer, praying to the many-faced God, who she doesn't fully understand yet, is that if he was a proper God, he'd hear her.
It's so charming how earnestly she believes that she's the judge of what makes a proper God.
I know. The proper God is obviously in her mind because she is 10, 11, the one who does what she wants.
It's just Jock and Hagar to her, I guess.
Right. Pretty much, yes. So her days here at the House of Black and White consist of various tasks around the temple and the kitchen. And it says that when she's not busy, she's free to explore as long as she doesn't descend to the 3rd basement level.
It's such a nice little tease. Gurm is building towards her getting down there and dance.
Yep, exactly. It's mentioned a couple times. We'll note it again here. The mysterious 3rd basement level. The kindly man allows or probably encourages her to ask questions, and she asks him at one point about all the people who come in seeking death. She's remembering the fear of death that all the people in her own experience had. You know, the squire at the inn, the stable boy in King's Landing, people that she's seen, crying. Not, these people aren't ready for death. They don't want it. They're terrified. But the kindly man tells her that death is a relief for these people. It's not a burden. If people are worried, he mentions that there are these candles, which actually I believe turns out to be one of her duties, is lighting these candles or taking care of them. And the candles calm them. And he asks Arya what she smells from the candles. She thinks they smell of Winterfell. So in her mind, she thinks, Winterfell, she might have said. I smell snow and smoke and pine needles. I smell the stables. I smell Hodor laughing and Jon and Robb battling in the yard and Sansa singing about some stupid lady fair. I smell the crypts where the Stone Kings sit. I smell hot bread baking. I smell the godswood. I smell my wolf. I smell her fur, almost as if she were still beside me. But then she lies and just says, I don't smell anything. So
predictable Arya.
Just Arya, yes. But the kindly man, of course, knows that she's lying and says, you may keep your secrets if you wish, Arya of House Stark. He also knows who she is, even though she keeps telling him she's no one. He tells her she can go home at any time, but that if she goes, she's not going to be allowed back again. And she says she doesn't want to leave. But he says, okay, if you stay, you've got to serve Valor Dohaeris. And she does. She's got lots of jobs, including helping the kindly man when he walks around the temple and to discover all the dead bodies. Becomes one of her tasks. Then she assists the other acolytes in stripping them and washing them. And then after they're stripped and washed, they're taken to the 3rd level. Blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't know what happens after that.
It's so interesting. I think this chapter is like very on theme for what George wants to do. One's teasing level 3. The other thing is emphasizing Arya being afraid. Here, I think he puts a little finer point on her fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's this fear of having nowhere to belong. And the candle brings that into stark relief, of course. She's home and she belongs somewhere again when she smells the candle. That's exactly where she goes.
Yeah.
And it's sweet and sad at the same time.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of really sad and poignant parts of this. I don't know if it's in this part. I didn't make a note of it, but there's one part. I think it's when she's thinking about what happens to the bodies down in the 3rd level. She it happens to be eating pork, and it says she stops eating and just like stares at her plate in horror, just because she has this thought. Just nothing that she says out loud. She's thinking about it. But the kindly man, as usual, sort of reads her mind and is like, it's just pork.
Not a Frey pie yet. we're
No
not
free
there.
lunches. But she's suitably horrified at that. She's got her own little little room, and in her cell or her room, she keeps all the gifts that she got from the crew of the Titan's Daughter, as well as other, things that she brought from Westeros with her, including Needle. And with Needle in her hand, she practices swordplay as often as she can, like in the evenings. But one day the waif sees her, and the next day the kindly man pays a visit to her cell and tells her that if she wants to stay with at the House of Black and White, she has to give up all of her possessions because they are the possessions of Arya Stark, and Arya Stark is not a servant. She's a lord's daughter, uh, and if she wants to serve, she has to stop being that. Um, so he kind of lays down the law.
Yeah, it's such a poignant exchange because the kindly man seems to call out all of her worst fears. He literally says that there is no place for Arya Stark here. He also calls out her pride, and we know her pride's important to her. This is the girl who tells gods what are proper. So I think it's pretty clear that the kindly man has cut her deeply. And in fact, George writes, "I serve," she said, "wounded."
Mm-hmm. It's so deeply insulted that he would, you know, throw shade on her service. She served. She served at Harrenhal. God, right? I mean,
I can do anything. And there's one of her dance chapters. She's like, "Well, I could be the very goddess of humility."
right?
Very
Which
Arya.
implies the exact opposite, right?
Perfect.
So the kindly man tells her that if she doesn't want to stay at the House of Black and White, that he'll help her. There are other paths for her in to follow in Bravos, or he'll help her return to Westeros. He'll if she wants to be a courtesan, he'll find a place for her. If she wants to marry someone, he'll find a husband for her. If she wants to go back to Westeros, they'll find a ship for her. So she's got the person who's finally offered to help her get home, which she's been trying to do since
Mm.
the end of Game of Thrones. But at this point, as we know, she's pretty much lost all of her hope for home. So she says, nope, she wants to stay because there's only one thing now that is motivating her with regards to Westeros, and that is her vengeance. Of course, this list that is strictly forbidden for her to say out loud. But he does warn her that women serving the many-faced god is not a normal thing. They have very few female servants because women are life bringers, and this god brings death. He says that the god is going to consume her and take every part of her, and that he thinks she can't handle it. And she, of course, being Arya, says, I can give up anything I want. And he tells her, we'll start with your possessions. So
Oh yeah, not your stubbornness, but that would work too.
right, exactly. Maybe start with your attitude, but
I
yeah.
love all these paths that he calls out for her are really interesting. Return to Westeros, marriage, be a courtesan. So, and I think that's worth returning to. I also think it's really interesting that all these alternates are juxtaposed with these threats about what she has to give up. So again, George is not being subtle that there are options for her when she leaves, and neither is the kindly man, right? They've already planned out all these things that they could do with her if her service doesn't work out.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And anytime up to a certain point, he implies
Yeah.
she just has to say, okay, I'm out. Get me a husband or put me on a ship or so. So now she's been challenged to get rid of her possessions, and she's boldly said she'll give up anything she wants. Well, maybe she doesn't want to give everything up. So that night she sneaks out of the temple, and I will read this passage. It says, in the black of night, she rose again, donned the clothes she'd worn from Westeros, and buckled on her sword belt. Needle hung from one hip, her dagger from the other. With her floppy hat on her head, her fingerless gloves tucked into her belt, and her silver fork in one hand, She went stealing up the steps. There's no place here for Arya of House Stark, she was thinking. Arya's place was Winterfell, only Winterfell was gone. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. She had no pack, though. They had killed her pack, Sir Ilyn, and Sir Meryn, and the Queen, and when she tried to make a new one, all of them ran off. Hot Pie and Gendry and Yoren and Lommy Greenhands, even Harwin, who had been her father's man.
Hanky break.
Yeah. So she's yeah. Well, compose yourself because it gets better.
Yeah, that's right.
Prisoners. It says she gets to the canal, she throws everything away, everything except Needle, which she just cannot bear to part with. It says she stood on the end of the dock, pale and goose fleshed and shivering in the fog. In her hand, Needle seemed to whisper to her, "Stick them with the pointy end," it said, and "Don't tell Sansa." Micken's mark was on the blade. It's just a sword. If she needed a sword, there were 100 under the temple. Needle was too small to be a proper sword. It was hardly more than a toy. She'd been a stupid little girl when John made it for her. "It's just a sword," she said aloud this time. But it wasn't.
Needle was Robb and Bran and Rickon, her mother and her father, even Sansa. Needle was Winterfell's gray walls and the laughter of its people. Needle was the summer snows, old man's stories, the heart tree with its red leaves and scary face, the warm, earthy smell of the glass gardens, the sound of the north wind rattling the shutters of her room. Needle was Jon Snow's smile. He used to mess my hair and call me little sister, she remembered, and suddenly there were tears in her eyes. Polliver had stolen the sword from her when the Mountain's men took her captive, but when she and the Hound had walked into the inn at the crossroads, there it was. The gods wanted me to have it. Not the seven, not him of the many faces, but her father's gods, the old gods of the north. The many-faced god can have the rest, she thought, but he can't have this.
Just we probably all need a minute here, but that is probably one of the most iconic passages in the series. Wouldn't you say? Just
Yeah.
yeah,
Definitely
certainly.
the reason this chapter came to mind for me
Yeah.
as one of my favorites.
Yes, when you first sent it to me, I was like, "Oh, Arya II and Feast," which yes, I know. Yes. So, also this here, I liked this little detail. A little bit more on Arya's point of view about gods. She seems to be implying that hers are superior. The old gods, her father's gods, the gods of the north. At least that their wishes trump those of the many-faced god, because the many-faced god wants her to get rid of all of her possessions, but the old gods want her to keep Needle, and that's the gods that she listens to. So I like that.
Yeah, I like her ranking, and I also like how opposed her ranking is with the philosophy of the faithless men, who the idea of the many-faced god is that there's not really a ranking among gods, right? But
Right?
not for
Yeah.
Arya Stark.
No, they're all the same. That's that, But yeah, no. So she hides Needle behind a loose stone in the steps, and she knows, that she's going to come back for it someday. She actually says, "You'll be safe here. No one will know where you are but me." And then as she hides it, make sure she counts the steps so she knows where to find it again one day. It says one day she might have need of it. One day, she whispered to herself.
Not subtle.
Not subtle, and also that's our through line to Mercy. So
Exactly.
yeah, the day did arise. We know when she did need it, and she made good use of it. So, or I mean, the part of us that loves vengeance as much as Arya does thinks she made good use of it. But obviously, there's more to say about that. So the kindly man obviously knows that she's done this, because the next day, the kindly man takes her and tells her all about the beginning of the Faceless Men. It's the big backstory info dump, and I know we have probably a lot to say about this in a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the chapter.
Yeah.
I obviously favorite part's the needle stuff, but I love the way that this lore dump connects the Faceless Men into the rest of the story.
Mm.
But it works well to save for the end because it does not necessarily fit with the rest of the chapter.
Right. It is definitely a lore dump, but it's a good one and a necessary one, and yeah, it's there's just so much good stuff in there about a lot of different things that aren't even remotely related to Arya. So it's um so at uh once he's done telling her all this lore, he asks her who she is, and she says no one, and he knows that she's lying. He says a man doesn't need to be a wizard to know truth from falsehood, not if he has eyes. You need only learn how to read a face. So that begins this sort of, he's telling her uh, about ways that you can learn how to lie effectively by kind of in a reverse way, because he tells her, oh, some liars blink, some stare, some look away, some lick their lips, cover their mouths. Arya, we know, chews her lip. So he's telling her, like, sort of what not to do if you want to lie effectively, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's nice. I mean, he tells her then that no secret will be safe from her. But what Arya really wants is the reverse, or the contrapositive, something like
yeah.
that. She
Mhm.
wants for her own secrets to be safe, and we'll see that explicitly later in the chapter.
Yeah, for sure. So she really wants to learn, and then of course the kindly man says, that she can. The waif is going to teach her, while they learn each other's language, so the sort of lessons will be looped in with this language instruction, and then she becomes uh, a novice of the many-faced god from that day forward. But there's this line in that passage where it says she would be no one if that was what it took. No one had no holes inside her, and that one is yet another just small part of this chapter that just breaks me every single time, because of course that is a callback to Arya 12 in A Storm of Swords, which is the post Red Wedding chapter. After she's had the dream, she knows she's seen Nymeria dragging Cat out of the water. She knows her mother is dead, and this is the quote from her point of view. She could feel the hole inside her every morning when she woke. It was a hollow place, an emptiness where her heart had been, where her brothers had lived, and her parents. The hole will never be any better, she told herself when she went to sleep. She would be no one if that's what it took. Then crystallizes what she's fleeing from grief and despair and fear, seeking a way to make everything stop, to make all that empty, aching hole inside her just go away. So currently, she thinks that vengeance is going to do the trick. That's her probably at this point the only thing she could think of to fill that hole in. But of course, George has a lot to say throughout A Song of Ice and Fire about the futility of vengeance. So, yeah, I expect time is going to tell how effective that strategy is for our girl.
Oh,
Yeah,
I just want to give her a hug.
I know, we do. And, we can root for her, when she as those names fall off her list. But yeah, there's a deeper message there from George, which we'll save that for the deeper message part of portion of the program. So they're learning each other's language. Arya has a little bit of difficulty with Brevosi, but she's doing okay. Uh, but then they start to play another game, which Arya calls the lying game, where they have to guess about, they say something to each other and have to guess whether they're lying or not. And so again, this is more just Arya learning how to sort of beat them at their own game, I guess, because she's learning how to lie. The waif tells her she's 36 years old. when Arya thought she was about her age. So she's shocked, and she asks the kindly man, who tells her that the poisons have made her that way. The poisons, she takes care of the poisons in the temple, and apparently handling poisons has given her this permanently youthful appearance. It's interesting.
Curious.
Yeah. So, but then we do also, this is another way he sort of reveals to us um, the way the House of Black and White functions, the Black Pool, because she understands, aha, every evening the waif emptied a stone flagon into the waters of the Black Pool. So it's, a light clicking on for Arya. Now she knows what happens. The people come, they drink from the pool, and it's a poison that sends them off into the arms of the many-faced god.
I really do enjoy being in Arya's head during the sort of like training montages. I
Mhm.
particularly love that she struggles. She thinks my sentences are as crooked as my stitches used to be while she's learning Bravosi, which recalls Needle a little bit for the reader. She also thinks too stupid to learn, too stupid to give up, which is such a deeply Arya thing. And she's so she's so charming while she's struggling.
Yes, she is. It's true. Um, so she how she was a, page at Harrenhal, so she gets tapped to sort of fill a similar function here, because you get many servants of the many-faced god who come visit the temple. These are people like Jaqen, who are out in the world doing the business of the House of Black and White, and they come and have meetings and such. And this is a kind of ongoing thing during her Bravos chapters, right? So I like that she gives them all. She doesn't know any of their names, and that, I mean, obviously by design, none of them use names. So she just in her head names them: the fat fellow, stern face, the handsome man, the squinter, the lordling, and so on and so forth. So one time she's serving the fat fellow and the squinter as they're talking with each other, and she's struggling to stay awake. And as she's standing there, she dissociates into Nymeria. Uh, she's telling herself to be still as stone. She's still using those catchphrases from Sirio Farrell. Um, so it says, before the night was done, her wits were wandering. Standing there with the flagon in her hands, she dreamed she was a wolf running free through a moonlit forest with a great pack howling at her heels.
These wolf dreams are like Arya's version of meditation. This is really interesting. As she's getting deeper into her service as no one, i- isn't she becoming more Stark-like, more deeply connected with the wolf? Or is it maybe that being no one augments her warging ability because she's disidentified from her own body, from her own idea of herself?
Mm,
There's so much going on
yeah.
here.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So like the harder she tries to sublimate Arya of House Stark and become no one, the deeper that internal connection with the wolf becomes. And eventually we'll get to chapters where it's strongly implied that she has wolf dreams every night, which is a bit of a departure from her earlier experience. And then yeah, I think that goes hand in hand with this. Like the more she buries Arya, the more whenever she's unguarded or sleeping, she's going right off into Nymeria. It's
Yeah,
like
it's the
kinetic.
psychological
Mm,
version of every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
exactly. Yep. I agree. So Arya is very curious about these visitors and wants to know if they're wearing their real faces. And the kindly man says, "Well, what do you think?" And she says she doesn't think they are. And she once again asks him about Jaqen. And the kindly man once again says, "I don't know, Jaqen. I don't know what you're talking about." So he's obviously never going to give her any actual information about that. She asks about changing one's face, and the kindly man responds that it takes years of practice and sacrifice, and advises her to start by practicing making faces and controlling her muscles. sort of like, like just literally making faces. And then he asks who she is, and she says, "No one." And he says, "A lie, a sad little lie." But now she has some motivation to learn how to control her face. Rule your face, she told herself, and you can lie.
Such an interesting motivation. And it's sort of baked into the training in such a contradictory way. She makes more privacy for herself by learning self control. In seeing through her lies, they can see through her defenses. So the more she learns, the more power over them she gets.
Hmm.
And I mean, the lie here, it's the lie that she isn't afraid, it's the lie that she isn't Arya.
Hmm.
So how interesting that her motivation is to be able to lie.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. I love as she's talking to the kindly man. She's You can almost see her taking notes in real time. She's like, "Okay, Arya, bad. No one, good. Lying about this is hard. He calls me out every time I say I'm no one, but he just threw me a lifeline. We'll teach you how to lie." Oh, she's like, "Oh, great, check, got it. I'm on it." She's, um, yeah, it's they pretty much laid it out there for her the way in which they will teach her to learn how to beat them at their own game.
It's like
So,
Arya's version of law school.
yeah. Oh, it's awesome. She is we're getting near the end of the chapter, so she's uh given a new task now that she's an acolyte, helping other people prepare the corpses uh, for who have died. She's washing the dead. She's spending her free time making faces in mirrors and learning bravosi and just really trying to become no one, but only on the outside. Handling the bodies of the dead makes her remember old Nan's story about northern men leaving their hearths during particularly long winters. And I wondered, you know, because she makes this connection, I assume that this is probably her only other exposure to people taking their own lives.
Mm,
She was initially quite mystified about these people just peacefully coming into the temple and choosing to give up their lives. And then she thinks about it, and she comes up with this story about these men who are doing this as a in a community service kind of way, removing themselves from the pool of people who need to eat. So I think she makes an interesting connection there. Uh,
it's
yeah. What do you think?
it's super interesting, I think, that she makes this connection because it's not as though Arya isn't aware of people that have sacrificed themselves for her sake. Like
Hmm.
Yoren did,
Right.
Syrio did.
Hmm.
And then she also very much remembers the Hound begging for mercy. So
Hmm.
it's so interesting to me that this is the memory that comes up for her now.
Yeah, and it's almost like she separates, death like by the sword with this
Mm,
other sort of like, I've chosen this death, but it's not bloody and violent. It's something different. Yeah, it's
yeah.
she I think it goes hand in hand with what she was thinking earlier um, um, about the differences between the people being afraid of death. Not that Sirio or those people weren't afraid, but that's sort of in the violent death bucket. And then you have
Yeah.
this and those old Northmen who would just willingly walk out into the blizzard and never be seen again. I think that somewhat mystifies her. So that's interesting. So her Bravosi has gotten, I think he says it's atrocious, but it's it's good enough for the time being. And he says you're gonna leave us for a while, and go live out with somebody in the city. She's gonna serve this man Brusco who sells shellfish. I did it. By pushing his cart through the streets, and she'll be the his hawker basically. And he asks her to choose a cover identity, and she chooses her mother's name. We don't know, yeah, if the kindly man knows that she chooses her mother's name, but she creates a story with his help. Kat is an orphan from King's Landing whose father had been an oarsman on the ship Nymeria. So she chooses all the
Oh.
things that mean something to her as her cover story. So
Yeah, I'm skeptical here that the kindly man doesn't know that Cat was her mother's name.
yeah,
I'm very skeptical. Also, that she throws in the Nymeria detail too. It just seems a little over the top.
mhm,
I think it's also great that this chapter ends with Arya as Cat, and then the next chapter is Elaine. So we have Cat
yeah,
Elaine.
Adeline, yes, I like that too. Love that sort of. So yeah, this is basically the end of the chapter. She, but for this part, she leaves the temple to go to Briscoe. She is now Cat. She's outfitted differently, in disguise. She's going to live with this Bravosi family. And as she leaves, it says, Sir Gregor, she chanted as she crossed a stone bridge supported by four arches. From the center of its span, she could see the masts of ships in the Ragman's harbor. Dunson, Raff the Sweetling, Sir Ilyn, Sir Merrin, Queen Circe. Rain began to fall. Arya turned her face up to let the raindrops wash her cheeks, so happy she could dance. Valor Morgulis, she said. Valor Morgulis, Valor Morgulis. Um, so she she gets to say her prayers out loud for the first time. She thinks, no one can hear her. Presumably they can't.
Well, no one can hear her.
No one can hear her. I'm guessing none of the people from the House of Black and White can hear her. So it makes her really happy. So that's that's interesting. Um,
Yeah, it's the singing in the rain is what comes to
mhm.
mind for me.
Yes, she's like, yeah, you could see like a big musical song and dance number. She's like,
Yeah.
woo. The chapter, in case you didn't pick up on it, begins and ends with Arya saying her prayer, which is just one of George's little stylistic things that he does that makes you go, oh, you're so good. You're so good. So yeah, this chapter is, like we said, it's all about Arya being still Arya. We get this real, look at her internal world, but we get so much other stuff too. Um, let's talk about Needle. Talk a little bit more about Needle.
Yeah, I what I love is that what Arya is actually gives up completely in that scene are the trappings of her fake identities. The
Mhm.
fingerless gloves, the floppy hat. And after she sheds him, it's almost like she comes more into herself rather than less. It's like she sifted through everything that she had been and found the one true thing. I love too, like along those lines, when she gets her acolyte's robes after she's hidden Needle, her first thought is that they're as buttery soft as her blanket at Winterfell. And then right after that, when she thinks about how hard her lessons are, she's thinking of Sirio Farrell. These are not just Arya Stark's memories, they're safe, homey Arya memories.
Mhm.
They're like candle inspired memories,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and of course, she still returns to her prayer, like we just talked about, but there's this kind of starkish resolve that seems to settle in on her throughout this chapter.
Mhm. Yes. And speaking of Starkish, um, Warging. So we get one, one scene that we talked about in the summary there, where she dreamed she was a wolf. And I might have said, in case I didn't, she has wolf dreams or thinks about wolf dreams in every chapter after her mother dies. And I
Mm.
think prior to that, it was fairly rare. At least it's not mentioned. Okay, so after Kat dies, it's almost a constant thing. And of course, I did say this, that her time in Bravos, it gets more and more and more frequent. Um, where she's, eventually is thinking of herself as the night wolf, as her self, her inner self is the night wolf. So
There's a lot that George is doing in this chapter to emphasize Arya's connection with Nymeria. One is that when she recites the lone wolf dies and the pack survives memory from her talk with Ned, she thinks her pack was gone. Yet to the reader, we're like, and yet, Nymeria has a pack,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Nymeria is not a lone wolf. And also, when Arya smells the candles, the very last thing she smells is, I smell my wolf, I smell her fur, almost as if she were still beside me. Of course, because that connection makes it as though she is.
Right.
And I love that we get in these kind of subtle ways that are not just the warging. In other parts throughout the chapter, we're weaving in Arya's connection with Nymeria, and I just love how well that's done in this chapter. Another thing that I think is really interesting about Arya's warging is how much we relate to Arya warging into Nymeria. Now, I may only be speaking for myself here, but in a lot of ways, Arya is like us. She's powerless and afraid. She's immersing herself in a fantasy where she is the predator and not the prey. It's not a world where she's safe, because for Arya, fear and violence are ever present. Safety is impossible. But it is a world where she has power. And this is the world where she returns to her Stark identity, her wolf blood, both as a symbol and as a kind of imaginative liberation. She's imagining her own freedom. And the wolf is a representation of House Stark, but it's still not her entire true self. The wolf is not Arya's integrated self. It's her dissociated one. Arya's not a shapeshifter. Her body is unchangeable, at least so far. But her mind can leave her body. And so I think this is really interesting. I think it's a theme that George is going to come back to when he explores the nature of vengeance, is Arya's connection with her wolf. And, can she go too far into the wolf? Does that take her away from her humanity? And I think that we're beginning to see how the wolf is both a source of power and sort of a source of dehumanization for Arya.
Yeah. I think when I wrote about some of these themes in our Arya series, I was pointing out that Arya doesn't have somebody like Bran has Jojen Reed, who's warning him not to spend too much time in the wolf, that he risks losing himself. She doesn't have a mentor telling her how any of this works, or what's dangerous or what's acceptable. In the same way, Bran sort of doesn't either. Jojen has is telling him the basics, but nobody ever tells Bran not to warg a human being, for instance, or skin change a human being, to be more precise. But yeah, I think that that's something that Arya's going to have to deal with, is sort of having to figure it all out by herself, while this is such a very strong and powerful pull that's being exerted upon her, on her identity. Yeah.
She gets so much catharsis in the wolf, just like she gets catharsis from the prayer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a good way in which George intermixes this thing that is cathartic, this vengeance we want, this power we want, with something that's darker and more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. Here she's feeling very, like you said, you said this already. She's feeling alone, and then at the same time, she can just close her eyes and be Nymeria running free with this wolf pack howling at her heels. That's incredible. It's probably exactly what she needs, or what she thinks she needs, in these moments. So, yeah. Shall we move on to horror?
Yes.
Talk any more about right from warging into horror?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about how this is a horror chapter, and
Mhm.
as I was listening to you and Joe Magician had a great discussion about how the prologue chapter is horror, and I think we kind of as readers we get so into Arya Stark as this, kind of powerful character that we kind of look past the horror in her chapters and we see them more as fantasy, right? But I think this chapter is fundamentally a horror chapter. It's about confronting the fear of losing yourself, of being erased, of there being no place for you. Like
Mhm.
we mentioned in the summary, the line, all men lie when they're afraid, that really clues us in to the fact that fear is at the core of this chapter when we think about all the times that Arya lies. But the other thing that's really palpable is this chapter underscores her many traumas. We were crying along earlier, and it's not just her losing her family. There's a lot of other moments where Arya has these kind of flashes back to awful things that have happened to her. She thinks Weiss would have beaten her bloody if he caught her in a lie, but it was different in the House of Black and White. They only raised their hands to kill. Oof,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And then there's another point where she thinks the kindly man says just so, and Arya thinks that those words made her sad. Sirio used to say that, Arya remembered. He said it all the time. Sirio had taught her needlework and died for her. I don't want to leave. So again, more of that angst and Arya's many traumas just are repeated in this chapter, the way that we hinted at the beginning that Arya is brave but still scared.
Mhm.
Um, and one thing that I wanted to talk about is how Arya's story is a horror story where the concealment of her identity is likened to purgatory, and we can get to that later, violence and death. In the House of Black and White, she actually encounters a repetition of the horrors she experienced in Westeros. It's a supernatural reduction and testing of her identity, where she must literally sacrifice her physical body to be born as something impermanent, no solid identity. We talked about all the faces that, or the names that Arya has worn before she came to the House of Black and White. So this
Mhm.
is just such an obvious sort of continuation of this arc. And the faceless men ask Arya to lean into this, to go completely towards losing herself. Um, and I'll read the longer quote here because I think that there's some language in here that's worth focusing in on.
Mhm.
She thinks that the kindly man's trying to scare her away. Arya thought, just like with the grave worm. That's why, by the way, I almost picked Arya 1 because I love that grave worm
Mhm.
moment so much.
Yeah.
Um, she says, I don't care about that. And the kindly man arguing back says, you should. Stay in the many-faced God will take your ears, your nose, your tongue. He will take your sad gray eyes that have seen so much, your hands, your feet, your arms and your legs, your private parts, your hopes and your dreams, your loves and your hates. Those who enter his service must give up all that makes them who they are. Um, and there's something about this passage that, really hits home on a lot of the horror of Arya's story. And there's this part that comes before it where the kindly man says that women aren't often servants of the many faced God. And it emphasizes too the role of gender in violence in Arya's story. I just re-listened to y'all's very first episode, the coverage of the Mercy chapter, and you pointed out that there's this sexual menace in the
Mhm.
Mercy chapter that
Mhm.
begins directed at Arya. And I kind of think that that menace is present throughout all of Arya's arc in A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, Yoren has her pose as a boy because of the threat she will be raped.
Mhm.
Consider Jane Poole as an alternate reality for Arya II. Her position puts her at risk of forced marriage and murder. We see the
Mhm.
same thing with Lady Harnwood, with Sansa and Joff. Arya might be a proud name, but it's not a safe one. And much of the horror of that is centered on how unsafe it is to be a girl child. Arya
Mhm.
has already, in some ways, given up her gender and herself in her pursuit of safety. Add to that how she already hates dresses. It's a bit of a gender misfit. And we get to this story where all this gender performance in every direction has forced Arya in ways that don't fit with her authentic self. She goes through hell to conceal who she is. And her gender becomes one of the many sites of unsafety and discomfort for her.
Mhm.
I just talked for a long time, but I think this is such an important
Yeah.
part of what George is doing with Arya's story.
Oh, I agree 100%. I think this is great, and I also love this other quote that you brought, which um, you can read, but if you want to break from talking, I'd be happy to read it. But you brought it into
Oh,
the documents.
yeah, well, I would
How
love for you to read it. Yeah, the George R. Martin quote from Dream Songs.
quote
Please
from
go ahead.
George talking about horror. So we all know that George does write horror, has written lots of horror in his life, and is a big fan. So um, this is from Dream Songs, and if you haven't read Dream Songs, I highly, highly, highly recommend it because in addition to getting all of George's earlier works collected, you also get these interludes where he's writing stuff, and it's probably as close as an autobiography will ever get from George. I think these inter these little parts in between the sections. So in this one, he's talking about horror. He says bad horror stories concern themselves with 6 ways to kill a vampire and graphic accounts of how the rats ate Billy's genitalia. Good horror stories are about larger things, about hope and despair, about love and hatred, lust and jealousy, about friendship and adolescent and sexuality and rage, loneliness and alienation and psychosis, courage and cowardice, the human mind and body and spirit under stress and in agony, the human heart in unending conflict with itself. Good horror stories make us look at our reflections in dark, distorting mirrors where we glimpse things that disturb us, things that we did not really want to look at. Horror looks into the shadows of the human soul, at the fears and rages that live within us all. They concern themselves not simply with fear, but with life in all its infinite variety, with love and death and birth and hope and lust and transcendence and the whole range of experiences and emotions that make up the human condition. Whew.
I mean, I think George has really delivered on his definition of good horror with Arya's
Mhm.
arc. You can see how that's all woven into her story.
Absolutely. As I'm saying those things, reading that, I'm thinking of examples, like this, yep, check, check, check. Most, almost all of those. And the ones that aren't present yet probably will be eventually, let's face it. Um, so yeah, I thought thank you for bringing that quote because I think that was fantastic. Um, so
Yeah, it's
yeah.
it's a good one, and I think that it thinking about Arya through this lens, particularly because he talks about, the kindly man talks about giving up your loves and your hates, right?
Mhm.
And because Arya's story is about the loss of friendship and it is about her adolescence, it
Mhm.
is about her rage, it is about
Mhm.
her loneliness.
Yep.
Um, and when we think about the way that George uses that to paint this to tell a horror story, I think it really gets at the poignancy of Arya's arc, and it gets for me at why this chapter specifically really works for me because it is looking at Arya's identity through this horror
Mhm.
type lens, through this dark, distorting mirror that we get in the
Mhm.
House of Black and White.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how he makes the point that horror, good horror, is internalized. It's not something that's external. It's not, you know, it's not about vampires and axe murderers. It's about
Yeah, it's
the
about fear and rage.
Mhm.
That's all internal.
Mhm. Yeah. So it's, this is probably what some people mean, or, this is part of maybe what some people mean when they say that he's, um, inverts tropes and all of this. But, I tend to think that George probably knows more about, he works within, um, he's a genre writer, so he's working within horror and fantasy, sci fi. um, he knows the tropes inside and out, and he probably is simply really getting at their true sort of platonic identity more so than axe murderers, for instance, which is very surface, very shallow interpretation of that genre.
I think horror has a really deep relationship with fantasy too, and I think you
Mhm.
and Joe Magician got at this a little bit
Mhm.
in your episode. But I recently reread The Lord of the Rings, and I was thinking that the whole Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Wights, which is something that's absent from the the movie, but obviously because the Lord of the Rings movies have a very horror type director, we get
Yeah.
a lot of horror moments. But I think one thing the Lord of the Rings does really well is it makes horror about internal fear. It's
Mhm.
about Frodo and Sam and the hobbits' courage.
Mhm.
And Arya becomes a really good stand-in for Frodo and Sam in the way that she's brave in the face of fear. And that is it's horror, but it's also fantasy, and it speaks to the way the two genres are interwoven and kind of have been from the beginning.
Mhm. Oh, yes. I mean, I agree. I mean, I am um not a horror aficionado at all, but a lot of early horror stories really are they're fantasy. They're
Yeah.
also early fantasy stories. So, um definitely I think genre fiction in general, um one isn't really that different from the other. For, well, if you're
Mhm.
talking about sci-fi, fantasy, horror, probably would have to make a big stretch to put romance in in that bucket, but maybe someone could. I just don't know enough about it, maybe, but yeah, but they're it's just a matter of how you tilt your head and look at it. They have so much in common. Um, so I mean, there's a reason why sci-fi, fantasy, and horror writers tend to come together. Like thinking of conventions that I go to and such, and yeah,
Yeah.
there's usually a pretty big crossover between all of the genres. So let's move on and talk about the foreshadowing for Arya hitting the road in this leaving the House of Black and White. I mean, she just got there, but some
Yeah.
foreshadowing here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hit on the various warnings from the Faceless Men like pretty well as we're running through the chapter. There's this great line where the kindly man says, "If you cannot obey, you must depart." It's like, okay, well, pretty explicit there. The other thing I think is really interesting is that to know Arya even a little, you have to know that she cannot obey. So there's this like sense that behind these warnings, the Faceless Men may have some larger agenda, because I do think that they have at least some sense of what Arya is up to. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of the tension in this chapter too.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and then, the other thing that I think is set out a little bit in this chapter is Jane and Arya. And I know this is sort of your baby of a theory,
Mhm.
um, but when there's this line where the Faceless Man is telling Arya about their origins, and he says, "We believe that a dark angel walks with you from the Nightlands, and when our sins and our sufferings go to grow too great to be born, and that's when people come to the House of the Black and White." And the first person I think of when I read that is Jane Poole,
Mhm.
because whose sufferings have grown greater in the story than Jane's.
Yeah.
And I also think too, as we have all this discussion about Arya not being Arya Stark, it's hard not to think about eh, the person who is in fact doing the opposite thing, who is not
Right.
Arya and trying to be Arya.
Mhm.
Uh, Jane is Arya in order to be safe-ish, but I guess to stay alive. While Arya is, I guess, playing dead in order to be safe. So you see that they're kind of characters are inversion aspects of each other.
Yes.
And I think
Mhm.
that's really palpable in this chapter for me.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a super point, and yeah, we do. We talked about this in when I was a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the Mercy chapter about the idea that Arya and Jane will, in fact, switch places once again. That Jane will end up in Bravos, and Arya will end up back in Westeros, taking Jane's place. So Arya being Jane, being Arya, by possibly she's got a little bit of a road to travel before she gets there. But let's say Jane comes to the House of Black and White and does what people do there when their sins and their suffering grow too great to be borne. Uh, we find out what happens on the third level of the basement ultimately. And, so if that were to be something that Jane did, then certainly there's the possibility that her face becomes um, available to Arya. So, um, yeah. So these two sort of, kind of swapping roles in this very dark and scary way, but back and forth. Um, I think is in keeping with, everything George is saying about identity. And I will add, although we actually talked about this a little bit, but as we're talking about foreshadowing, I don't want to move on without pointing out that the someday when she hides Needle obviously implies that one day, one day she will retrieve it and she will be Arya again, which this, of course, will lead to her exit from the House of Black and White. And do you think that will happen after Mercy? Do you think she still has um, too much learning?
I think the wheels have to be in motion. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe she stays for a little longer, but I imagine it has to be transitional because the faceless men have been pretty clear about how if she doesn't obey, she has to leave, right? And
Mhm.
that's part of what's set up so strongly in this chapter. And then later, she's already messed up, right? She already
Mhm.
has the mistake where she kills the Night's Watchman, but they keep her, right? But how
Yeah.
many times?
Yeah.
I
How many
just
times are
wonder.
they gonna?
Yeah, let her go. And I wonder if Jane Poole becomes an excuse for them to maybe they okay, well here you can go back to Westeros. You can leave and everybody's happy.
Right. Exactly. Like they were finally got rid of this problem child, or I don't know. I mean, she the fact that she's hidden Needle away and thinks to herself someday, and then that means when she goes and retrieves Needle, that really symbolizes her retrieving her identity. Um, so she's done that in the Mercy chapter, and also there are no whispers that cannot be heard in the House of Black and White. So the kindly man heard her whispering Raph's name, Raph the Sweetling.
Mm, yeah.
So when Raph, a guy from Westeros named Raph, turns up dead, um, or missing, because maybe the eels will eat his body and he'll never be found, but he'll be missing. Um, they're going to know exactly what happened. So, and there's very little possibility of her hiding that from them, I think.
Yeah, you don't get to answer your own prayers, right? That's the
Mm,
key rule of the faceless man. You can only kill, and you're only supposed to kill someone you don't know, right? And
that
that's
too.
set up
Yep. Right.
throughout these chapters.
Mhm.
That's why people in Arya 1 keep telling Arya their names over and over again,
Mhm.
because it's a kind of well-known rule.
Yeah.
But
Even though she
it,
has no idea. I think
yeah,
that's
she doesn't
hilarious.
know why this is
Why do they keep
happening.
saying their whole name to me? Um, yeah, no, that's very true, but yet she keeps doing it. This is the second person she's killed for her own reasons.
And so,
Um,
so much of this has
yeah.
to depend, right, on what we think the faceless man's goals are with Arya and how much they already knew. Because I suppose if they have some larger purpose for her, which maybe includes sending Murder Machine back to Westeros,
Mm,
um, then maybe they are tolerating a certain level of misbehavior from her because they're expecting to use her as an instrument in some deeper way.
mhm,
And I suspect that that has to be at play here. But we just don't. I don't think we know enough to really
mm,
speculate about what the faceless men have in mind for Arya.
yeah, I agree. I think we have to. There's will be more information. The classic keep reading, but it's not going to be just from Arya because, of course, we have in Sam chapters we've got um, in theory, if the timeline doesn't jump or anything, you have the person who was Jaqen, who is now then was
Yeah,
the um, then was the hook nose man, and now is Pate. So he's obviously got some sort of mission as well, and I think we'll learn more about his mission, which might be revelatory for what maybe they have in store for Arya. Because I agree that
yeah.
it doesn't make any sense that they would just keep going. Oh, you kid, it's okay. Better luck next time. I mean, they seem to have these very strong set of rules that they all live by, and to for her to continually be breaking them all is well, you know, there's got to be a reason why they keep letting her stick around.
For
They're
sure.
not a charity, and he makes that very clear. So, yeah. So, um, next topic, next note that we had, which I think is very interesting, is talking about the Bravos in the House of Black and White as a kind of purgatory. So let's
Yeah,
go there.
I
Let's go there.
I have wanted to talk to you about this for a while. You guys have talked about the Riverlands as kind of a liminal space, about the inn at the crossroads as kind of a
Mhm,
liminal space.
mhm,
I think Bravos is a step further out there. It's more like Odysseus in the underworld, tangling directly with death. When
mhm,
Arya exchanges Valar Morghulis and Jack and Hagar's iron coin for passage to the House of Black and White, she's leaving behind the metaphorical hell of the Riverlands in favor of descent into the underworld itself. And it makes sense. She turns towards violence and death because she already feels dead. There's a hole where her heart should be. Yet she's not quite dead yet. And it reminds me of the underworld in Virgil and in the Odyssey, because there's a sense when the living are among the dead that death is not for the living. And I think the kindly man tries to evoke a similar feeling in Arya, this feeling of revulsion. It's wrong. You don't belong here. For example, he inspires that feeling with the image of the grave worm, and by constantly pushing Arya with how much of herself that she has to give up.
mhm,
And in this chapter, the sense that Arya doesn't belong in the underworld is just so strong. And I think it's meant to tell us that Arya still has a role among the living as Arya Stark and not no one.
mm,
In the Odyssey, Odysseus goes to the underworld to seek supernatural guidance from the prophet. I can never say the name Tiresias. And the guidance is about how to journey home.
mhm,
Interestingly, he encounters his dead mother there, but isn't what Arya is seeking in her true heart the same thing that Odysseus is seeking when he goes to the underworld?
mm,
Knowledge about how to get home safely.
mhm,
Yet Arya still has lessons to learn in the underworld before she can continue her journey. And I think this journey, the journey to become no one, it has a lot of parallels with Bran and Jon and also with Sansa's stories. Bran is out there tripping on weirwood paste, seeing visions,
mhm,
literally seeing through another face, the faces of the weirwood. John is very literally a living Master Aemon's advice, kill the boy and let the man be born.
Mhm.
Sansa is in a stasis of sorts in the Eyrie, playing Persephone to Littlefinger's Hades. All of them must be reborn before they can go home. All will or have to experience the wrongness of death to come home, to be fully alive again after so much loss. And I think we have cutting the 5-year gap to thank for this. This is what it was so important that George R. Martin show that he changed his plan for the structure of the novels.
Mhm. Yes, bravo. Thank you. I agree. Just what a great analysis because you're right. You know, all the parallels. But I really love the underworld take. I don't think I ever really thought about it, but now as you're talking, I'm thinking about Odysseus. I'm like, yes, you are
Well, and
spot on.
the black pool too. I mean, in
Mm,
the Odyssey, the underworld is a pool.
right.
And we have that exact imagery
Mhm.
in the House of Black and White.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I think that is great. And it certainly, George takes from everything from history, mythology, things that he has read, and it's definitely this is not the certainly not the first time. I mean, we've talked a lot about Sansa as Persephone. We I recently published an essay about Stannis as Agamemnon. So
Mm.
um, George is obviously pulling heavily from classics, even though on the surface, probably a lot of people would just say, yeah, he's inspired by probably mostly European or specifically British history. But there's so much other stuff that it's really fascinating to deep dive into that. So thank you for that because I think that was really cool.
It's
I
so important to George's project, I think, because he is in dialogue with the genre. And to be in dialogue with the genre, you have to talk about all of its predecessors.
Mhm.
And it's just the way that he weaves all these things together, I think, is really fundamental to the project that, A Song of Ice and Fire is.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. So, all right. Well, we're getting towards. Well, we still have plenty of notes, but we're getting.
Just pick and
I
choose.
yeah no we have also plenty of time, but we're getting like this next thing is more from the end of the chapter. So, um, we kind of talked about this. She's so happy at the end. What's your take on that? I mean, she's on a mission from God, was what I wrote down, which is kind of obviously a joke, but definitely given her statement about Needle and the old gods and all that. I mean, yes, she did. She does have the gods in the back of her mind. And uh, she's got this list, which is kind of like her little to-do list, and anything that gets her closer, one step closer to checking things off that list is a good thing. And I think that she's happy about maybe making progress towards her goals. But there's other things too, obviously.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just like this moment of palpable freedom for
Mhm.
Arya. She's
Yeah.
finally leaving the House of Black and White, and she feels like she's not under anyone else's control. Now,
Mhm.
I'm not sure how true this is really. I think she's being supervised, but I think she feels free.
Yes.
Um, and the imagery that George gives us just of the rain falling on her and her wanting to dance, that just seems like the emotion that she's feeling is one of spaciousness.
Yeah.
Finally, after having gone from place to place, she feels like she's carved out this little tiny space of freedom.
Yeah. It reminds me of, old art, the original Arya from Game of Thrones, who could just sort of run around and get into mischief and do what she wanted. And I mean, she felt like she was completely free in those moments, although there were people that were constantly probably wondering where she was or chasing after her, both, at Winterfell and specifically in King's Landing. In fact, that sense of freedom of being out and about, and as you read those chapters going forward in Bravos, they feel very much like her early chapters in King's Landing, where she's just kind of scurrying around the city, discovering things and, exploring and just being carefree. And so she's specifically free to be a child,
Yeah.
even though, she's a child who isn't Arya of House Stark in this moment. So she can do things that nobly born children kind of can't do, which she was, to be fair, she was pretty adept at doing, even when she was Arya of House Stark. But yeah, that, I think freedom is probably it.
It's Arya Underfoot again, right? That's the
Yep.
vibes.
Yeah, it's definitely the vibe. Yeah, there that she's just out there and, kind of doing her own thing again. Although, like you said, she's probably not not as much as she thinks.
Not as much as she thinks, yeah.
I always wonder, in fact, in her chapters with Briscoe, she kind of thinks about how they seem almost, Briscoe seems almost afraid of her, kind of like all the people from like the when she was on the ship, but I think he's not really afraid of her. I think he's probably afraid of her master, whoever, if it's the kindly man or whoever it is that spoke with this Brusco and made the arrangements for her. Yeah, I think that's your clue that someone is actually keeping tabs on what's happening there, because I truly don't think that Brusco would actually be afraid of a scrawny 11-year-old girl without something standing behind her, So.
It's really masterful just on George's part that we get Arya noticing that he's afraid, but Arya doesn't realize why. It's just such a nice little detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Typical Arya, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, oh, he's afraid of me. So let's. I'm going to move this to the end. This other part, I thought was fascinating about Eastern philosophy. This is another really fresh take that made me so happy that I asked you and that you picked this chapter.
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, whether or not the House of Black and White has some deliberate allusions to Taoist and Eastern philosophy. I mean, first of all, the black and white is yin and yang.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that kind of obvious level. But part of the entire idea of Eastern philosophy involves non-dualism. And so I thought to emphasize that, I would read this passage from Tao Te Ching. And this is actually from Ursula Le Guin's translation of Tao Te Ching, which if you have not read, it's sort of delightful that we have this sci-fi author who's made their own translation. So here it is. The way you can go isn't the real way. The name you can say isn't the real name. Heaven and earth begin in the unnamed. Name's the mother of the 10,000 things. So the unwanting soul sees what's hidden. The ever-wanting soul sees only what it wants. Two things, one origin, but different in name, whose identity is mystery. Mystery of all mysteries, the door to the hidden. I love how much this fits with the idea of people in the House of Black and White having no name. I love the idea of the House of Black and White's doors being the door to the hidden, the idea of identity being a mystery, and a little bit of a shower thought, but I think it's really worth thinking about in the context of the House of Black and White, what if losing yourself has this more philosophical dimension of decentering the self, of expanding your consciousness, your view of yourself in the world, so that you can let go enough to become someone else? And this is truly an idea that's deeply embedded in Eastern thought, both in Zen and in Taoism. And I think we take for granted, from a Western perspective, that losing your identity is bad. But from a more neutral position, we can also see it for Arya as rebirth, as the shedding of a burden. And I think that when we view the House of Black and White from a more Eastern perspective, it becomes easier to see how these themes of non-dualism, of identity not being fixed, are actually a philosophical worldview, in addition to a magical one. And from a magic perspective, I do think there's a connection between the Faceless Man's training and Arya's increased warging abilities. We talked about this a bit earlier. Her idea of herself becomes more flexible, and so that has a philosophical and a magical dimension. It fits with the theory that John goes into Ghost. He must die or become no one in order to survive, to physically become another. I just think that it's really an interesting way to look at the House of Black and White, to look at loss of identity from, take a little bit of a positive spin on it, and think that maybe in learning to let go of some of her burdens, Arya might be learning a very valuable lesson about what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She's certainly learning as she grows, I think, learning more about her internal self, and maybe identity is something that's maybe more external. Although I don't know, I can't claim to know much about Eastern thought, but just going off what you've said, that's what comes to my mind. That you release that shell, maybe, to find your true self.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've really hit the nose on the head for like what I was going for, and what I do think is a if a little bit, if reduced for the time period that we have, a really core part of this perspective on looking at things. And Hymn of Many Faces too, there's some very specific meanings that has in Eastern philosophy too. The idea of individuals having like a face that's malleable. So I really do wonder if it's something that George is deliberately playing with.
The language definitely lends itself to that interpretation, I think. So yeah, that's another fascinating observation, I think. But I think the last thing we have before we kind of wrap things up is, and this is actually one of the things you said you were most excited about with this chapter, is the Faceless Man lore dump. So, what do you love about that, and what does that sort of tell us about their role in the story overall?
Yeah, so I love a good conspiracy as much as the next person, and the Faceless Men lend themselves really well to both conspiracies that are explicit in the text and ones that are not. And so this is one of the things I think that first caught my attention when I got into the fandom. So it's near to my heart for that reason. So to kind of summarize what I love, it's the connections to old Valeria. We learn that the Faceless Men arose in the 14 flames of Valeria. Well, that's so interesting, because that means they're older than the city of Bravos. We also know from the World Book and from various parts of A Song of Ice and Fire that Bravos was founded by escaped Valerian slaves. And we don't have an explicit connection between the Faceless Men and those escaped slaves, so I won't say that connection exists explicitly, but I do think it's implied that there may have been some help there. And the escape from the torment of slavery is part of the origin story of the faceless men who say that they began in the mines of Valeria. This is a super long passage. I'll try to go quickly here, but
Yeah.
um, so the kindly man is explaining to Arya the horrors of slavery in old Valeria, and Arya asks, "Did the slaves rise up and fight?" The kindly man says, "Some did. Revolts were common in the mines, but few accomplished much. The dragon lords of the old freehold were strong in sorcery, and lesser men defied them at their peril. The first faceless man was one who did." And I love this. "Who was he?" Arya blurted. No one, he answered. Some say he was a slave himself. Whoever he was, he moved among the slaves and would hear them at their prayers. Men of 100 different nations labored in the mines. Each prayed to his own God in his own tongue. They were all praying for the same thing. It was release they asked for, an end to pain, a small thing and simple. Yet their gods made no answer, and their suffering went on. Are all the gods deaf? He wondered, until a realization came upon him one night in the red darkness. And this is like now the faceless man's mission statement that we have here.
Mm-hmm.
All gods have their instruments, men and women who serve them and help to work their will on earth. The slaves were not crying out to 100 different gods, as it seemed, but to one God with 100 different faces, and he was God's instrument. That very night he chose the most wretched of the slaves, the one who prayed most earnestly for release, and freed him from his bondage. The first gift had been given. So Arya then complains that he should have killed the masters, which is the reader is the very good stand-in for the reader there, and the kindly man reveals that he would bring the gift to them in time. And there's a very good fandom theory that the faceless men may have been involved in the doom of Valeria, which makes sense, given this, the way this story is told. So what I'm really fascinated about by this story is how the faceless men in Bravos are going to fit in with the broader story. Are they going to ally with the anti-slavery Dany? Or are they going to oppose her because she is a dragon lord? And I think the story is set up to make us wonder what the faceless men are plotting, particularly given that we're, at this point in the book, we're in the middle of Dany's struggle against slavery. So I think when we read this passage, it's Daenerys that I sort of think of the most. Mm-hmm. Consider, too, the city of Bravos has its own identity theme that parallels others in A Song of Ice and Fire. We learned in this chapter that its moniker is the secret city. The very mists Arya walks in Bravos concealed the city from the Dragon Lords, the city's own mask, that was worn like Arya's various identities to conceal the dangerous true face of the city. It's just so interesting to me that this city, whose first law is no slavery, it's written in stone on the bridge, will be forced to take a position on Daenerys. Like, what will that position be? Mm-hmm. And you talked about the Pate and Jock and Hagar business that's going on. Well, what's going on with that? How is it connected to the broader story, and what is the faceless man's agenda? I don't have a great answer other than that I want to know.
I do too. I wonder if you think, are they very well aware of, the reality of Dany and her dragons, and for how long have they been aware of that? Arya, you hear through maybe not an Arya chat. Yeah, I think that it does get mentioned. The Dragon Queen, it's mentioned by sailors, that device that George uses, down at the docks, but you hear that in that Sam chapter. There's talk. So there's talk in Old Town at the docks about Dany and her dragons, and there's talk in Bravos. It's it's mentioned in a Sansa chapter. So the sailors are certainly talking about it, and I would be very surprised if the faceless men remain sort of in the dark, or if they're being dismissive of it. So I think they probably know a lot.
I think the whole city has to be very clued in. I mean, it's a city that's formed by escaped slaves from the Dragon Lords.
Mhm.
I think it's their very MO, if they deal in information, which we know the Faceless Men do, that they have as much information about Daenerys as anyone, as anyone else does. That's, I guess, as far away from where
Right.
she is, but
Mm.
I think they've got quite a good deal of information about her.
Mhm.
Um, the other thing that's interesting too is, you know, are Daenerys's eggs the eggs that were sort of mortgaged, that were stolen
Mm.
and given to, and potentially made their way to the Iron Bank, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Did they make their way to Bravos?
Mhm.
Um, and if that's the case, is there something more at play here?
Yeah.
Like, I, I have no idea. It's like, I, but I do think it's interesting that if it's true that Daenerys's eggs sort of indirectly came through
Mhm.
Bravos and maybe had been there for a long time,
Mhm.
that George has something in mind for interweaving
Right.
Bravos with the
Yeah.
rest of the plot.
I agree. I don't think he would have made Bravos the third point of that triangle if if he didn't have a reason, because writers write things for a reason. So that particular detail, I mean, like you, I don't know, what to fill in, how to fill in the blanks, but I mean, I can speculate and wonder how did Lirio get his hands on those three eggs, um, and seems like maybe, I don't know, were they stolen? Were they won, bargained for, purchased? Like, who knows how he got them? But I think I agree that it seems too much of a coincidence that the Iron Bank and the Faceless Men, whom we assume to be um, intertwined with each other and also with the Sea Lord, um, for them to not know that somehow those eggs used to be buried in a vault in Bravos, and now they're out there with the Dragon Queen. And of course, once they hatch and the stories filter back to Bravos about Dany and her three dragons, well, that's it's not a big leap to think what they would be thinking about that. So,
And it is kind
yeah.
of like an Easter egg to put like in this chapter that
Mhm.
folded in with Arya's story in this lore
Mhm.
dump. We
Yeah.
get this connection back to the
Mhm.
rest of the rest of
Mhm.
the story. I love it. I think it's
Yeah,
just really smart.
I do too. I love it. I love the fact that it's in an Arya chapter, and a lot of it has, like I said before, it has not a lot to do with her specifically, especially, from the historical point of view. There are certainly things that are affecting her present and will affect her future, but just having all that backstory, it was we did an episode about the Doom of Illyria last year, and this was one of the primary sources. I mean, there isn't a lot more. This is the biggest chunk for sure. There's other little references, including in other Arya chapters, but this big chunk here is, um, yeah, it's a lot of important information that reaches into other parts of the story. So, yeah, um, yeah. So I guess with that, um, let's recap why you picked this chapter, because we've just been talking about how wonderful that part is, but there's other stuff too that we can.
Yeah, I mean, one, I think it's underrated. I think when people say what their favorite chapter is, this is not likely to come up. I thought a little bit about John 13 dance, but I've
Mhm,
talked a lot about Jon Snow and kind of wanted to talk about something else.
mhm,
And I also think it's kind of buried in Feast, and it's just this real gem of a chapter that
mhm,
is worth coming back to. Um, So that's part of the reason. I also think the Arya and Needle stuff is just the best stuff about Arya's identity in her arc,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that we, as we've been talking through it, it really does provide a roadmap for kind of understanding and unlocking her character and where it's going. One thing I personally relate to, just there's this big middle finger that Arya gives by keeping Needle.
Mm-hmm.
She says, "No matter who you make me be on the outside, there's part of me that's just for myself that's in there, and I know who
Mm-hmm.
I am, and that's
Mm-hmm.
just for me." I love that.
Yeah.
It resonates with me a lot, and I think it's beautiful. Um, like we said, I love the Faceless Men lore drop. I love speculating about what those candles are made of. Is it somehow a gentle version of Shade of the Evening that doesn't
Yeah.
make you paranoid?
Yeah.
Probably not, but those creepy childhood memories Yankee candles, they live rent free in my head.
Yes,
And
they do.
I just love how much this chapter parallels with Bran and with Jon and Sansa. This is a gray city and a green sea. There's all this beautiful green seer kind of imagery that comes up in
Mm-hmm.
Arya's chapters, all the mists that cloak Bravos. And just a million reasons I love this chapter. We've hit on almost all
Mm-hmm.
of them. So I'm just so happy that we got to spend time um, with this chapter, even though it made us sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay though. I mean, we read one of the many reasons that we read fiction is to feel emotions. So, um,
Sure.
the good ones and the bad ones. It's a safe way for us to feel those. So I love it. I mean, why else would we read A Song of Ice and Fire?
That's right. Yeah,
there's
not to,
there's not a lot of it's not known for its happiness. So we obviously find a lot to enjoy about it.
noted hope punk author George R. R. Martin.
Right, exactly. No one ever accused one of my favorite stories about um referring, recommending Song of Ice and Fire to someone was um I recommended it to my mom years ago, and every time she'd get to the end of the book, she'd say, "Oh, I don't know, nothing good ever happens." And I kept saying to her, "Oh, just keep reading, keep reading. It gets better." And then she got to beginning of A Dance of Dragons, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, nothing really good is going to happen. I've been leading her on all this time. And when she got to the end of it, she just called me and said, nothing good happened. Nothing. And then I've read 5 books and not one good thing ever happened. And I was like, well, there was that time Arya found Harwin.
I think that's why whether or not good things happen is like perhaps not the best litmus test for
No,
literature.
no, definitely not. Certainly not for George R. R. Martin. So, yeah, on that note, why we love A Song of Ice and Fire could fill the next 2 hours. Uh, I think we'll begin to close things out here. Thank you to Mary for being here. Um, we've worked together. I've known you for years, and we've worked together a couple of times, but not enough. So thank you. I'm really happy that you came on and that we had this time. It's really great. So tell us about yourself. What you're up to. I have your. Let's see where to find you. We're all on Blue Sky now. So you are
Hiding from Twitter.
at
Yeah.
themary.bluesky.social.
Yeah, you can
Yeah.
find me there. So I started a podcast, The Heart of the Dragon. I covered I covered the season of House of the
Mhm.
Dragon last year now. And my plan is to kind of start some projects back up with this podcast again in the late spring, early summer. Work is super intense for me right now.
Mhm.
And I want to be able to devote the kind of have time to
Mhm.
devote to it before
Yeah.
I get it started again.
Yeah.
But definitely stay tuned for stuff from me there.
Awesome.
And um, Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Always a
Mhm.
delight to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Especially, I know you're busy, so I doubly appreciate you making the time, taking time from work and family and everything, and on a Saturday night to be here. So thank you. And on that same by the same token, thank you to everyone who's been watching us live. And also thanks to people in the future who will be listening to pre-recorded. We definitely appreciate the support. Thank you to the Sathorian for the super chat, which rolled by me, but I caught up with it in the chat a few minutes ago. So thank you so very much for that. As far as Radio Westeros, we are also on Blue Sky, radiowesteros.com at Blue Sky. And if you go there, you can find me and Yoke Boy. And then what's up with us is we're working on, we just finished our Arya series last year. We started Bran back in December. So we've got some more Bran analysis coming up. Also working on an episode all about the free folk. And of course, we have these live streams, which will be ongoing every other month. The next stream will be Saturday, March 15th, with Emily the Erie. And the chapter
Ooh.
is still TBD, but that should be a good conversation. So, yeah, so for now, this is a bi monthly thing. But yeah, definitely keep in touch with all of us. Forget that we are patron supported, and we do certainly appreciate any form of support from you, our listeners. Keeps us going. Speaking of which, if you're watching or listening on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, because that means a lot. That's a form of support, and we definitely appreciate it. So thank you ever so much, everybody, and so long from both of us, and bye for now. We'll see you next time.